Ah, my dear readers, we now find ourselves at the beginning of Act 2 of this Miss Marple detective mystery tales, a turning point where the plot thickens and shadows deepen. For those who wish to catch up on the events of Act 1, I must direct you to the video linked in the description and comments section. Do give it a listen, and once you're quite up to speed, do share your thoughts in the comments. After all, every detail matters in a tale such as this. Now, let us proceed, shall we? Act 2, the dinner car gathering. The dining car was resplendent with opulence. White linen, gleaming silver, and crystal chandeliers casting a soft glow that should have been calming, but tonight felt stifling. The passengers, their faces pale, sat in tight clusters, their eyes flickering nervously toward the front of the room, where Miss Marple had quietly made her presence known. There was no longer any illusion of comfort in this space. The air felt thick with suspicion, as if it too knew something was amiss. Miss Marple stood at the head of the room, her figure calm and composed against the backdrop of plush velvet seats and the rhythmic clinking of silverware. Her small frame seemed almost out of place in the luxuriously adorned car, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that was unmistakable, one that spoke of years spent watching and understanding the subtle dance of human nature. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the whispers like a knife, drawing every eye to her. "I believe it's time we talk." The murmurings died instantly, and all eyes shifted, some with apprehension, others with blatant discomfort. The missing passengers, the explosion, and the locked compartments were all hovering in the room like ghosts, and no one seemed willing to speak of it first. But Miss Marple had no such hesitation. "Please," she continued, her words smooth but carrying the weight of authority, "take your seats. I'm afraid there are matters that require our attention." One by one, the remaining passengers reluctantly took their places at the long table, their movements stiff, their postures betraying their unease. Monsieur Duval settled into his chair, his usual composure faltering just a bit as his eyes flicked toward Miss Marple. The military man, his jaw clenched tight, leaned back in his chair, his hand resting too firmly on the table. The art dealer and the lady in red exchanged brief glances before she turned away, her fingers nervously drumming against the edge of her glass. Miss Marple took a moment to study each of them. Their behavior told her more than they could have realized. "It's strange, isn't it?" Miss Marple began, her gaze sweeping across the table. "How quickly things go awry when a few simple facts are twisted, hidden, or ignored." The tension in the room thickened, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "The last night's explosion? Truly a disaster. A few were lucky enough to remain unscathed," she continued, her voice as steady as the slow, rhythmic clink of a spoon against china. "But what about the others? What about those who have vanished?" She let the question linger, her eyes narrowing just slightly as she let each passenger contemplate the gravity of her words. "The missing passengers weren't simply victims of an accident," Miss Marple added. "No, there's more to this than meets the eye. Someone here knows exactly what happened and why." The silence that followed was heavy. Not a single person moved, their faces betraying the unease they felt, but none of them spoke up. Miss Marple wasn't expecting them to. The answers were never in the initial panic, nor in the questions asked aloud. They were in the subtle exchanges, the way people shifted their weight in their seats, the tightness around their eyes. "I think we should start with the facts," Miss Marple said, her voice steady and her eyes never leaving those of her fellow passengers. One by one, Miss Marple began to piece together the night's events with quiet precision. She spoke with deliberate slowness, her voice methodical as she recounted what had transpired. "The explosion was no accident," she began, looking briefly at the lady in red. "It served its purpose, didn't it? A distraction, a smokescreen, nothing more. And in the midst of that chaos, a few of you found the opportunity to disappear." The lady in red shifted in her seat, her fingers going still for the first time since the conversation began. She didn't meet Miss Marple's eyes. "The locks," Miss Marple continued, shifting her gaze to Monsieur Duval, who was sitting with his arms folded, his lips curled in a tight smile. Those locks were tempered with, not just the one in the compartment where the explosion occurred, but the others as well, sealed from the inside, without force, without any obvious signs of break-in. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Monsieur Duval's eyes flickered just a fraction, but his expression remained smooth. He tilted his head, a small gesture of acknowledgement, but no words followed. Miss Marple's gaze lingered for a moment before she moved on. "A sort," she said, turning her attention to the military man. "A strange little detail, don't you think? The soot on the walls, the faint marks left behind like a signature. Whoever was behind this didn't just cause an explosion, they wanted to make sure they were covered. Literally." The military man's jaw tightened, his hands still resting on the table, but his fingers were now slightly curled. He stared ahead, unwilling to meet her gaze. Miss Marple allowed herself a brief moment of silence, letting the pieces settle into place. "And then there's the key," she said, her voice even. "The duplicate key found in the compartment. It's a small thing, a seemingly insignificant detail, but it's enough to confirm the theory I've been forming. Someone here had access to parts of this train that most passengers wouldn't even know existed." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Every person seated at the table now knew she was speaking directly to them, every word laced with implications. The art dealer shifted uncomfortably, his hand fumbling with his glass. The lady in red glanced at him, then quickly looked away, her lips tight. "Whoever left that key behind wanted us to follow the truma," Miss Marple said softly, her tone calm but carrying the sharpness of a scalpel. "But why? Why'd Eva something so easily traced?" A murmur passed through the table, the tension thickening, the question hanging in the air. The motive, why was it left? Why was it hidden? "I'll tell you why," Miss Marple said, her voice suddenly colder. "Because someone thought they were above suspicion. Someone here believes they're safe." She let her eyes flick around the table, pausing just long enough for each of the suspects to feel the weight of her gaze. The military man was sweating now, his fingers twitching. The art dealer had stopped fidgeting but still avoided her eyes. Duval, on the other hand, seemed unfazed, his calculated calm unsettling in its own right. The lady in red was still, too still, her gaze fixed on the glass in front of her, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Now," Miss Marple continued, the edge of her voice sharpening, "let's move past these small details and get to the heart of it. Someone here knows the layout of this train better than anyone should. Someone here had a key to a secret passage to the maintenance areas no one else is supposed to know about. Someone here has been using this knowledge to cover their tracks. The question is, who?" Her words hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. There was a long pause, during which no one moved. It was the kind of silence that suggested the truth was already circling, just out of reach, waiting to pounce. "No," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but final. "I think we should get to the bottom of this." The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. And just like that, Miss Marple knew that the game had changed. The pieces were on the table. Now it was just a matter of watching how each one moved. The dining car, once filled with the murmurs of anxious passengers, now held a quiet, oppressive air. The crystal chandeliers above cast a soft light over the table, but the warmth of the surroundings did little to ease the chill in the room. Miss Marple stood at the head of the table, her small frame commanding the attention of every person seated before her. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence alone was enough. The suspects, each of them tense and wary, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The military man, whose posture had always been rigid, now seemed to shrink into his chair. The art dealer's fingers tapped nervously against his glass, while the lady in red avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Monsieur Duval, however, maintained his usual air of calm, his eyes never leaving Miss Marple's as she surveyed the room with a practiced glance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began, her voice cool, steady, and calm. It's time we address what has been happening aboard this train. Her words were deliberate, each one landing with precision. She didn't rush. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the train's motion, and for a moment it felt like the world had stopped, suspended in the tension that wrapped itself around every person in that room. "I know you're all waiting for answers," she continued, her gaze sweeping over them, "and you will have them. But first, let me take you through the facts." Miss Marple paused, making sure her words sank in. "Earlier," she said, "there was an explosion. A loud one that caused immediate panic. But let's not be fooled by appearances. The explosion was a diversion. It was designed to cause chaos, to draw attention away from something else." She let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "Someone here," Miss Marple said, her tone growing sharper, "used that explosion to facilitate the abduction of certain individuals on this train, people who had something to lose, and people who could be used to leverage something far more valuable." The art dealer's face paled, his lips tightening as he shifted in his seat. The lady in red's fingers trembled on the edge of her glass, but she remained silent. "The first clue was the soot," Miss Marple continued, her voice now calm and authoritative. "The fine powder on the walls, the marks on the floor. Those weren't caused by the explosion. They were placed deliberately. Whoever caused this knew the train inside and out. They were familiar with its workings. Perhaps too familiar." She turned her gaze toward Monsieur Duval, whose eyes never wavered. "The second clue," she said, "was the duplicate key. A key that shouldn't have existed. It was hidden, left for us to find, but it wasn't just a key. It was a key to a secret passage, a passage that led through the hidden corridors of this train." A slight shift in Duval's posture was the only sign he'd heard her words. His smile, though tight, remained. "And that brings me to the locks," Miss Marple said, her voice lowering slightly. "They were tampered with. Not forcibly broken, but carefully altered. The locks were meant to seem secure, but they were meant to be opened by someone who knew exactly how to unlock them." Her eyes met Duval's now, and for the first time there was a flicker of something. The calm exterior he had maintained seemed just a little less certain. "Those tampered locks," she said, "the soot, the key, the secret passages. It all leads us to one person." Monsieur Duval, a ripple of tension moved through the room, the air suddenly thick with unspoken accusation. Monsieur Duval's calm demeanor cracked ever so slightly as Miss Marple's words hung in the air. His eyes shifted, his lips pressing tighter, but he didn't speak. "You've orchestrated everything, monsieur," Miss Marple said, her voice measured and confident. "An explosion, the disappearance of the passengers, everything was part of your plan. But why?" Duval's smile wavered for just a fraction of a second. He straightened, his gaze meeting Miss Marple's without blinking. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple," he said, his voice still smooth, but the underlying tension was unmistakable. "I'll tell you what I'm implying," Miss Marple replied, her voice crisp. "You didn't just cause the explosion for the sake of chaos. You used it to cover your tracks, to move your victims without anyone noticing. The explosion was simply a distraction for something far more carefully planned." Miss Marple paused for a moment, letting the room catch up with her words. "The passengers you targeted were influential," she continued. "People whose absence could be used for leverage in financial matters. You knew exactly how to take advantage of the situation." Duval's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. "Though where?" Miss Marple said, looking around the room. "Was here, within the confines of this train. The locked compartments and the secret passages led us to this conclusion. The very structure of the train was used to conceal what you were doing. You knew where the hidden corridors were. You've been using them all along." Duval's eyes flickered. There was a brief moment of recognition, and then his mask returned, smooth as ever. "They with whom?" Miss Marple continued, her gaze never leaving Duval's. "Involved someone else, the train's engineer. He was coerced into providing access to these hidden spaces, forced, perhaps out of greed. But he wasn't an accomplice. He was a pawn, someone you could control. The military man shifted uncomfortably, his face twisted in confusion and something else. Fear, maybe. And the how? Miss Marple asked, her eyes sharp. The key. The diversion. The tampered locks. It all leads back to you. The key was meant to unlock the passageway that you used to move between compartments, unnoticed. You thought you could hide in plain sight, but you made a mistake. You left too many clues. A shift in the room came then, a collective exhale, the tension in the air broken by the revelation. Duval's shoulders slumped slightly, his composure faltering. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come right away. He began, then stopped, his fingers curling tightly around the edge of the table. I didn't expect you to catch on. Miss Marple finished for him. She leaned forward, her voice almost pitying. You underestimated the value of small details. The key, the soot, the passageway, it was all too neat, too well thought out. You thought you could control the situation, but in the end it's always the little things that betray you. Duval's face was pale now, his earlier charm gone, replaced by a cold hardness. You were right, he said, his voice flat, but you've missed the point. This was never about the passengers, this was about power, about controlling information and manipulating those who thought they were untouchable. Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. And now you'll have to face the consequences of your little game. As Duval sank into his seat, the others in the room for the first time seemed to breathe easier, the truth now clear. Miss Marple had pieced together the puzzle, and though it wasn't over yet, the web of deception had finally unraveled. The game was over, and it was only a matter of time before Duval would have to explain just how deep his involvement had run. Miss Marple took a breath, feeling the weight of the truth settle around her. Justice, she said softly, is never as satisfying as people think. But it's always right. And with that, the final pieces of the mystery slid into place. The dining car was silent, the tension thick in the air as Miss Marple's words hung like a guillotine, ready to fall. The faces of the remaining passengers were painted with a mix of relief and wariness. Relief that the truth was coming out, but wariness at the uncomfortable realization of just how close they had been to something far worse. Monsieur Duval's face, usually a mask of composed elegance, now betrayed cracks. His eyes flickered, just for a moment. With indignation, the calm facade he had so carefully cultivated for the entirety of the journey was beginning to break down, the pressure of his lies squeezing his composure tight. He shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching at the edge of his glass, but he didn't speak immediately. His jaw tightened, his gaze locked on Miss Marple. His polished demeanor faltered, revealing a brief flash of what lay beneath. Frustration, but also the unmistakable hint of something darker. You've made your point, Miss Marple, Duval said, his voice low, but there was a sharp edge to it. But you have no idea what you're talking about. You're grasping at shadows. I am not the one responsible here. You're right, monsieur, Miss Marple replied, her voice cool, cutting through his defensiveness with ease. You're not responsible for everything, just for orchestrating the events that brought us here. The explosion, the disappearing passengers, the secret passages. You didn't act alone, but it was your hand that moved the pieces. Duval's lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. You think you have it all figured out, don't you? You've connected the dots, but you've missed the bigger picture. Oh, I understand the bigger picture perfectly, Miss Marple said with a dry, disinterested smile. The motive: greed, control, leverage, an attempt to exploit certain influential passengers for your own benefit. The train security, the locked doors, the tempered compartments, they were all part of a well-calculated plan. But it's a plan that failed, monsieur, because you underestimated one thing. Me. His eyes flickered for a moment. He wasn't used to being talked down to, especially not by someone who seemed so unremarkable. But Miss Marple wasn't bothered by his arrogance. She had learned long ago that confidence was often the armor of those who were most afraid. "I am a man of influence, Miss Marple," Duval said, his voice rising slightly. "You may think you've caught me, but you haven't. You've only caught a piece of the story. There are far more powerful people involved in this than you realize." Miss Marple's eyes never left his. "If there are more powerful people, monsieur, then I suppose it's just a matter of time before they take their turn. But for now, you're the one under suspicion." Duval's face reddened and his composure wavered. "You don't know what you're dealing with." "No," Miss Marple replied, "but I know exactly what I'm seeing, and what I see is a man trying to cover up his tracks before the truth catches up to him." The words stung more than Duval would admit. His fingers clenched the edge of the table, and for a split second his eyes flickered with something far more dangerous than indignation. But he masked it quickly, leaning back and forcing a laugh. "You think you've won, Miss Marple?" I think," Miss Marple said calmly, "you've lost." The moment of silence that followed was thick with anticipation, each breath in the room hanging on the edge of the conversation. Duval remained still, but his eyes flickered to the side, where the train's engineer had been standing quietly, his back against the far wall. The engineer, who had been trying to remain invisible in the corner, now shifted uneasily. The color drained from his face as he realized the focus was slowly shifting toward him. Miss Marple turned her attention to the engineer, her voice cool but firm. "You've been very quiet, monsieur," she said, her gaze never wavering. "But I think it's time for you to speak." The engineer swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly as he fidgeted with his cap. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if the words didn't quite come easily. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he stammered. "I was just trying to do my job." Miss Marple's gaze hardened. "You've been working on the train's maintenance for years, haven't you? You know its layout better than anyone. So, how is it that you didn't know about the secret passage?" The engineer's shoulders slumped, the weight of his guilt settling in like a heavy fog. "Duval? He promised me things I couldn't refuse. He told me it was just a bit of routine work. I didn't know what he was planning, not really, but I was scared. He threatened my family." The room seemed to exhale collectively as the engineer's confession spilled out in a rush. Duval's eyes narrowed and his jaw clenched. For the first time, Miss Marple saw a flash of real fear in his expression. "I didn't know about the people he was taking," the engineer continued, his voice quieter now. "I thought it was just a simple job. Open a few doors, make sure the train's running smoothly. But when I found out, when I realized what was happening, I wanted out. But Duval, he wouldn't let me." The tension in the room was palpable. The truth had finally spilled out. The engineer had been manipulated, used as a pawn in Duval's scheme, threatened with his family's safety to keep him compliant. Miss Marple leaned back slightly in her chair, folding her hands in her lap as the room processed the revelation. She had suspected as much. The engineer had known too much, but his actions had never felt like those of an accomplice. Now it was clear. Duval had used leverage, fear, to turn him into a reluctant participant. Miss Marple's gaze returned to Duval, who now sat frozen, the veneer of control slipping away like a cracked mirror. "You," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but heavy with accusation, "you took advantage of the engineer's fear. You used him as a tool to carry out your plan." Duval looked down, his hands curling into fists. "It was the only way," he muttered under his breath. "The only way," Miss Marple repeated, her voice sharp. "You used fear to manipulate someone into helping you, but it didn't end well for you, did it?" Duval's eyes darted toward the engineer, and then to the rest of the room. The walls seemed to close in on him. His time was running out. "I never wanted it to come to this," he whispered. "But now it's too late." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Not too late, monsieur. You've been caught. but you can still face the consequences of your actions. The truth always catches up. The engineer, his face pale, looked to Miss Marple. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to stop him. It's over now, Miss Marple said. You're free from his grasp. Duval, broken and defeated, sat back in his chair. The game was up. He had been outplayed, outsmarted by a woman who had nothing but her mind and an unshakable sense of right. Miss Marple stood up, her gaze lingering on Duval for a moment longer. The truth is always the hardest thing to face. But now, monsieur, you will face it. And soon, so will the rest of them. She turned toward the door, her mind already turning to the next steps. The mystery was solved, but there was still much to be done. The truth had been revealed, and in its wake there would be justice. But as always, it was never without cost. The first hint of dawn stretched over the French countryside, spilling pale light across the fields and the tracks that snaked through them. The train, La Belle Étoile, had pulled into a quiet station, its slow chugging almost imperceptible against the stillness of the morning. There was a shift in the air, as if the oppressive tension that had gripped the train for so long had finally begun to dissipate, replaced by the weight of expectation. Miss Marple stood at the window of the dining car, watching the station as it came into view. Her sharp eyes noted every detail, the subtle shift in the air, the slight bustle at the station as French authorities began to board. The officers, in their neatly pressed uniforms, moved quickly, purposefully. The calm of dawn seemed to settle over them, but there was an unmistakable sense of relief that began to seep into the very fabric of the train. "Here they come," Miss Marple muttered to herself, her voice barely audible. Her attention was drawn to a group of officers who, after a brief exchange at the platform, began to board the train. Their presence marked the official end to the mystery, the beginning of the resolution. They moved with quiet authority, but it was the sudden shift in the atmosphere that told Miss Marple everything. The situation was under control. Monsieur Duval would soon be in their custody. A moment later, the door to the dining car opened and a tall officer stepped in. His presence cut through the last remnants of tension. "Monsieur Duval?" the officer asked, his voice firm but not unkind. Duval, still seated at the table, remained unnervingly calm, his face a mask of barely contained resignation. He stood slowly, his movements smooth despite the unmistakable edge of defeat in his posture. "You know why you're here," the officer said, his tone final. "I do," Duval replied softly, his eyes flashing once toward Miss Marple. "Seems I've been caught. But I never thought it would come to this." The officer nodded, motioning for two other officers to move in and take Duval into custody. They led him out of the dining car without a word, but Miss Marple noticed the tension in the room ease ever so slightly. As Duval disappeared from view, the other passengers in the car released the breaths they had been holding. Their collective anxiety lifted, and even the lady in red, who had been frozen in place for hours, allowed her shoulders to relax just a fraction. The officer turned back toward Miss Marple with a nod of acknowledgement. "The passengers are safe, Miss Marple," he said, his voice now softer, the formal tone giving way to a quiet gratitude. "We'll take it from here." Miss Marple only nodded in return, her expression unreadable as she watched the authorities move through the train. The final pieces were falling into place, but she wasn't one for public triumphs. She simply stepped back, allowing the professionals to handle the aftermath. Her work, for now, was done. The next few hours saw the quiet resolution of what had been a tense, harrowing ordeal. The rescued passengers, including the few who had been hidden away in a concealed baggage compartment, were given immediate medical care. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with the lingering trauma of what they had experienced. But there was no mistaking the relief that bloomed on their faces as they were finally freed from their ordeal. The train's engineer, meanwhile, was taken aside by the authorities for questioning. He looked a little less ragged now, his shoulders still tense, but his posture had softened since the truth had come to light. Miss Marple watched from a distance as the officers spoke with him in hushed tones. There were no signs of anger or blame, only calm resolution. She could tell that they would be lenient with him. He had been a pawn, manipulated and coerced into complicity. After the engineer had been cleared, Miss Marple made her way toward him. She didn't say much, just offered a quiet glance of understanding as he looked up at her, his expression filled with a mix of guilt and relief. "You did what you had to do," she said simply, her voice low. "But now it's over." The engineer nodded, his lips trembling slightly as he whispered, "Thank you for seeing the truth." Miss Marple gave him a small nod, and for a moment the weight of the case seemed to settle around her, as if all the air had been let out of a balloon. The mystery had unraveled, the puzzle had been pieced together, and now only the last bits remain. As the officers finished their rounds and the train's usual rhythm began to return, Miss Marple stood in the dining car, watching the passengers slowly return to their compartments. There was no real joy in the resolution, no sense of personal victory. She hadn't done this for praise or accolades. She had done it because it was necessary, because, in the end, justice always caught up, no matter how carefully the criminal tried to hide their track. As the train began to roll forward once more, Miss Marple found herself seated by the window, watching the French countryside unfurl before her. The morning light caught the distant hills in a pale glow, the mist slowly dissipating as the world came alive again. She allowed herself a moment of reflection. The case, though resolved, left her with a gnawing feeling of something left unsaid. The nature of deception, the way people twisted the truth, always struck her as both fascinating and tragic. How easily people thought they could control others with threats, with lies, with fear. And how easily they were caught, in the end, when someone simply paid attention. She thought about Monsieur Duval. He had been clever, no doubt. He had played the game well, manipulating everyone around him. But in the end, it wasn't his cunning or his control that had given him away. It was the simplest thing: his arrogance. He hadn't accounted for the details, the little things that often went unnoticed. The soot, the key, the passageways. It had all seemed so well hidden, but it was those very things that had tripped him up. As the train continued its journey, Miss Marple turned her attention inward for a moment longer. The mystery was solved, and justice would be served. But she knew that the world would keep turning, and that there would always be more to uncover, more puzzles to solve. It was the nature of the world. A world that, on the surface, seemed so neatly ordered, yet beneath was full of secrets. For now, she allowed herself a small, contented sigh. The case had been resolved. For the moment, at least, everything was in its rightful place. The soft hum of La Belle Étoile slowed as it pulled into the station, its final stop for Miss Marple. The train, once a source of tension and mystery, now felt like nothing more than an extension of the past. The problem had been solved, the perpetrators caught, and the secrets of the journey laid bare. It was early morning. The sun had only just begun to rise, casting a gentle golden light over the rolling hills of the French countryside. The air was cool, crisp, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the night before. Miss Marple stood at the window for a moment, watching the landscape pass by as the train slowed to a halt. She had no need to rush. There was no further mystery to unravel here. The answers were all in her mind now, carefully filed away. She stepped off the train with the same quiet grace she had displayed throughout the case. The station was peaceful, almost idyllic, with only a handful of early risers moving about. A few porters busied themselves with luggage, and the faint scent of freshly baked bread drifted in from the nearby village. The train's bustle was a distant memory, now replaced by the calm of rural life. With a final glance at La Belle Étoile, Miss Marple took a deep breath. The case had been far more than an explosion in a few missing passengers. It had been a study in deception. How easily people believed they could hide the truth, when all it took was someone willing to look a little closer. She walked down the platform slowly, her heels clicking softly against the cobblestones, each step measured and deliberate. The mysteries of the train, the locks, the soot, and the passageways had all resolved themselves in the end. But the people, the ones who had acted out of greed, fear, or arrogance, were not so easily forgotten. As Miss Marple walked, she mentally reviewed the case. Duval's smooth, calculated demeanor had fooled nearly everyone, and yet in the end it was his overconfidence, his belief that no one would notice the small details, that had betrayed him. The hidden passages, the duplicate key, the carefully planned explosion. Each piece had been a clue, leading her to the man who thought he was above suspicion. In the end, it was a matter of perspective. The smallest details, so easily overlooked by others, had led Miss Marple to the truth. The soot on the walls, the misplaced key, the subtle tension between the passengers. All of it pointed in one direction. The truth was rarely as complicated as it seemed, but it was always hidden behind a layer of deception, waiting for someone with the patience to peel it away. The platform was quiet now, the train long gone, but the feeling of accomplishment settled over Miss Marple like a comfortable coat. It wasn't the thrill of victory that satisfied her. It was the certainty that justice had been served. The criminals were caught, the victims saved, and the truth was finally revealed. A modest carriage waited for Miss Marple at the station. She stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. As the coach began its journey toward her quiet village, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The countryside unfolded before her, the lush fields and quiet villages, a far cry from the tense atmosphere aboard the train. The case had been a reminder of the complexity of human nature, of the lies people told, the secrets they kept, and the way they believed they could control the world around them. But Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that nothing could remain hidden forever. The truth, though sometimes buried under layers of deceit, always found its way to the surface. As the carriage rumbled along the winding roads, Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. The case had been intricate, but not impossible. The true test of any mystery was not in how well it was concealed, but in how well it could be unraveled. And that, she thought with quiet satisfaction, was where her strength lay. There would always be more mysteries, more lies to uncover, and more deceit to expose. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most important thing was not the resolution of the case itself, but the certainty that justice, however long it took, always prevail. As the carriage moved through the sleepy countryside, Miss Marple looked out the window, the early morning light bathing the world in a soft, warm glow. She had solved the case, but more than that, she had seen the truth. The way people, no matter how clever or careful, were never as hidden as they thought. There would always be a way through the lies, a way to see the reality beneath the surface. And as the carriage rolled on toward her quiet village, Miss Marple couldn't help but think that perhaps the real mystery was not the case she'd just solved, but the endless dance of deception and the unshakable certainty that no matter how deep the lies, the truth would always rise to the top. The world might not always be what it seemed, but that was exactly why Miss Marple was always watching, always waiting, because she knew nothing ever stays hidden forever.